Hello everyone. Today we are going to be discussing about cell death and the major two pathways in which the cell undergo in order to die is there are two actually. Number one we have apoptosis and then the other one is necrosis. So concerning this presentation we are going to be talking about the apoptosis, which is a physiological one, the one we need, right? But we don't like the necrosis. So we are going to dive into the topic actually. So actually we are going to be starting with the definition of apoptosis. When we say apoptosis is a kind of programmed cell death because it is a kind of the cell before the cell undergo this kind of apoptosis or this kind of death, the cell has to program some kind of pathways, right? So the pathways has to be undergo. There are kind of steps the cell has to undergo. So this means this pathway of death is a kind of programmed. So right, that is it. So that's why it is said it is called even known as suicide because the cell it is the one that trigger it is on death. Right, that is the definition. It's called programmed cell death because it is the cell that programmed following a kind of steps for it to die. Right, so also known as suicide, cell suicide. And in apoptosis, actually, to add a kind of highlight, in apoptosis, for example, if we have a kind of group of cells like this, if this cell want to undergo an apoptosis, the neighboring cells will not even know that this cell is kind of going to undergo apoptosis. So this means the apoptosis of this cell or the death of this cell will not affect the rest of the cells. But in necrosis, death of this cell can definitely affect the neighboring cells actually, right? So we don't like that. So we like the apoptosis one. So now we are going to be diving into the causes of the apoptosis. So what will lead to this cell suicide? What will cause the cell to actually kill itself? So we have physiological factors and we have pathological factors actually that lead to this uh, cellular suicide. Actually, the physiological factors number one we have a kind of, for example, these occur in a kind of involution, involution of hormone dependent organs. So what do you mean by involution? Involution means like decrease in size. For example, if as we have already know that uterus need to increase in size almost to about 500 times or to 100 times in pregnant woman than in non-pregnant woman because in pregnant woman there is increase in estrogen and progesterone, right? So that hormones they are the one that will actually increase in the growth of that particular uterus to larger size. So whenever the pregnancy is finished or the pregnancy has been that's postpartum, so definitely the uterus need to return to its normal size. So the cell has to undergo apoptosis. So then if the cells of the uterus undergo apoptosis, so definitely the uterus will decrease in size. For example, this is the uterus. This is uterus in pregnant woman. This is uterus in a normal. So see, this is almost 5 times its in size, right? So definitely. So so by mere looking you can say it is 5 times, but actually in the real sense, it actually grows more than 100 times than the normal non-pregnant uterus. So for this uterus, large uterus, to come back to non-pregnant state, the cells has to undergo apoptosis. When the cell kills themselves, actually, so definitely the uterus will decrease in size, right? So that is it. So this occur due to decrease in the hormone after pregnancy. So because it is the hormone that make it to become this large. This number two. Number two, actually, the cells, any cell that cells that is harmful to our body. So which cell is harmful to our body? For example, our own cells. Sometimes there are cells of our body that are harmful to our own self. That is especially the immune cells. These immune cells sometimes can attack our own body in some susceptible individuals. So these kind of cells can actually be killed by apoptosis. So if they are killed, then definitely this immune cells will no longer attack our own body. So this is function. This is very important, right? So it is physiologic actually apoptosis. So also number 3, as we have already know that we have cytotoxic cells, cytotoxic T cells can cause apoptosis, in cells that are infected by virus, or they are willing to become cancerous, that are infected by virus. Because as we have already know that the cells actually, when virus want to attack cell, the virus used to enter into the cell and use the cell's own machinery in order to manufacture its own protein, right? And they will replicate itself. So the moment this virus enter into the cell, then the cytotoxic T cell will induce apoptosis to that particular cell. Then together with the virus are eliminated with the cell. So this is also another good important cause, right? It is physiologic actually. And also when a kind of cell is willing to become cancerous, for example, when the cell have mutation and that mutation cannot be repaired, so definitely this cell will undergo apoptosis. So it prevent apoptosis occur in mutated cells. So when the cell become mutated, so definitely for it to prevent the cell from becoming cancerous, so definitely that cell will undergo a kind of apoptosis. So that is it. Then we have pathologic. So in pathologic kind, this actually it is caused by a kind of pathologic process. For example, if there is DNA damage, if there is DNA damage due to any reason, for example, due to radiation exposure, and also, for example, after like exposure to reactive oxygen species, because these are produced in under, for example, under infections, because a lot of infections can cause production of this reactive oxygen species, and these are actually toxic to the DNA. So when the DNA is damaged, so definitely this cell will undergo apoptosis, so that to prevent the cell from becoming cancerous. That is it. And also we have another cause, accumulation of abnormal proteins or misfolded proteins. So as we have already known that anytime the proteins are synthesized, actually because the proteins are synthesized in large quantity, some proteins are actually misfolded during the protein folding, right? So some proteins, they are actually misfolded. So that misfolded protein will trigger a kind of elimination. When the cell can no longer eliminate the abnormal proteins, and then the abnormal protein accumulate inside that particular cell, this is pathology, right? So definitely this will trigger an apoptosis. The cell will actually kill itself. So that is it. These are the causes of this apoptosis. So now we are going to talk about the function. The most important function of apoptosis is this cell death actually. This cell death kind of cell death, it is the one that is occurring in embryogenesis. In embryogenesis. So what I mean in embryogenesis, that is during development of the child, the baby, like this. The hands actually, they are kind of having a webbed hand, right? This is the hand of the child. So the cells that are in between these fingers, they have to undergo apoptosis for us to have normal fingers like this. In between these fingers, we have a lot of cells here, a lot of tissue here, a lot of tissue here, a lot of tissues here. So during the embryonic development, so it is this cells, when this cell undergo apoptosis, so definitely we have these normal fingers like this. Also in toad, the toad actually lose this long tail of it by this kind of apoptosis, right? So that is it. So now we are going to see the next. It prevent cell from becoming cancerous, right? Cell from becoming cancerous. because cancer is problematic, right? So that this is cell. So that is it. So this is the function of apoptosis, some function of apoptosis, right? So now we are going to see the pathway, that is the mechanism, how this apoptosis is happening inside the cell actually. So the mechanism of apoptosis is actually be carried out in either of the two ways. Either may be due to, from mitochondrial, the signal it is coming from the mitochondrial, that is, it is coming from the cell itself. Number two, or it is due to kind of death receptor pathway, which is extrinsic. So this kind of pathway of apoptosis, it depends whether the signal that they will trigger the apoptosis is coming from inside the cell or it is coming from outside the cell. So in mitochondrial pathway, the signal is coming from inside the cell. That is called intrinsic pathway. While in death receptor pathway, definitely the signal is coming from outside. So this is it is kind of some outside signal will trigger this apoptosis. So now we are going to see the mitochondrial one. So that is the intrinsic. So the most important thing that will trigger this intrinsic pathway is when we have damage in this DNA. Due to any reason, we have started the damage of this DNA. What can cause DNA damage? We have started them in the causes of apoptosis part. So when this DNA gets damaged, actually, due to any reason, for example, due to excessive sunlight or due to reactive oxygen species or due to radiation exposure, some enzymes has to be triggered for the repair of this DNA first. So if this DNA become irreparable, for example, cannot be repaired, so definitely this cell has to undergo apoptosis, right? So the most important thing to trigger is a kind of protein called protein P53. So this protein P53 will actually a kind of activate another protein called protein ATM. Protein ATM. So this P53 and this ATM will associate themselves and actually activate a kind of protein called protein box. This protein box is very important because this protein box, this is a mitochondria, will cause a kind of disruption in the mitochondrial membrane. So when there is disruption in the mitochondrial membrane, some kind of proteins or some kind of factors will leak outside together with some ions. So most importantly, we have calcium will leak out because in the mitochondria we have calciums, and also we have another protein called cytochrome. Cytochrome C. So this calcium and cytochrome C will then associate themselves, and then what? And then activate a kind of protein called procaspase. Procaspase 9. So any protein you hear with the name pro something, which means it is inactive. So now this cytochrome C and then calcium, the other one that will actually activate this procaspase 9 and make it into active form of caspase 9. Now the pro will be removed and then the caspase 9 using that caspase 9 actually. So this caspase 9 will actually participate in the breaking down of some proteins found in the cells. As we have already known that for cell to undergo apoptosis, it has to degrade its own protein so that to undergo that kind of death actually, especially the protein that are found in the cytoplasm actually. So that is it. Then we are going to now see the extrinsic pathway, that is the pathway that is in which the signal of the apoptosis is coming from outside actually. So in extrinsic pathway, most importantly, we have a protein called, or a kind of molecule called TNF alpha. This is TNF alpha. So most importantly, this TNF alpha actually is produced by our immune system. So the most important factors that lead to this extrinsic pathway of apoptosis signaling is when the immune cell want to kill a virus infected cell. When this cell, for example, is infected by virus, so externally this immune cell, for example, cytotoxic T cell, will now come and trigger this cell to undergo this kind of apoptosis. This is the most important aspect or important factor that lead to this extrinsic pathway of signaling of apoptosis. So when this TNF alpha bind to its receptor, the receptor is known as death domain. Death domain. Actually, this death domain. So this will lead to activation of a lot of kind of proteins like fat protein, trad protein, but not they are not that much important. The most important protein we have to know in this is actually a kind of protein called procaspase 8. So procaspase 8 is activated into active caspase 8 actually. So this caspase 8, like the caspase 9, will now actually cleave the proteins that are found inside the cell cytoplasm, right? So that is it. So this is the pathway of extrinsic pathway. This is a pathway of intrinsic pathway actually. The signal is come in intrinsic pathway. The signal is come from inside. That is due to damage of DNA or due to accumulation of some substance in the cytoplasm. While the extrinsic, it is coming from outside. The TNF has to come from outside the cell, right? Then and trigger its own pathway. We have a lot of pathway steps, but the most important we have to know is this caspase 8, right? So in both the pathway, they have a common pathway actually. They meet at a common pathway. So this intrinsic pathway, at the end of the day, it has to activate a kind of protein called caspase 3, right? And also this extrinsic also has to activate this caspase 3. So what will happen is this caspase 3 is going to actually cleave the cytoskeletons. We have cytoskeletons that maintain the integrity of cell, right? So if the cell cytoskeleton is disrupted, so the cell will now going to collapse because it is a cytoskeleton that actually make the cell to be even to maintain the shape of the cell like this. So when this cytoskeleton is broken down by the caspase 3, we have caspase 3. In both the pathways, caspase 3 is activated. Caspase 3 is activated, right? Then this caspase 3 will now want to be to cleave actually the cytoskeletons of the cell actually. So that is it. That is called the execution phase. So it is doing two functions actually. It breaks this caspase 3. It breaks cytoskeletons, and also it breaks what? Number one, number two. Also, it breaks actually the nucleus. It fragments the nucleus. Why? Because this caspase 3, before it directly breaks down the cytoskeleton, but it has to activate a kind of protein called DNS. DNS. DNS, from as the name implies, this is the one that will going to actually cleave the DNA into segment. It will cleave it into particles like this, right? So when the nucleus is fragmented like this, so definitely under the influence of what? Under the influence of this DNS. And then what activates the DNS? It is this caspase 3. So that is it. Caspase 3 is doing two functions: breaking down the cytoskeleton and then activating DNS, in which the DNS will go and cleave the DNA into pieces, right? So that is it. So now at the end of the day, what will going to happen is this: after the cellular DNA is cut into fragment, so this cell will going to convert into something called apoptotic blebs. This cell will going to be like this. We're going to pinched into little tiny like this. We're going to convert into something like this. Some apoptotic blebs contain some fragment of the nucleus. Some are contained some lysosomes. Some are contained some lysosomes. Some are contained some mitochondria actually. So the cell will going to break into pieces. But we have to know that the important point in apoptosis is that the cell membrane of this cell is intact. Right? It is intact in each these apoptotic blebs. So this cycle things the cell transform into are called apoptotic blebs. Apoptotic are called apoptotic blebs. So what happens to these apoptotic blebs is macrophages will now going to perform their function here. They will actually come and engulf and phagocytose these apoptotic blebs like this. So that is it. So this is how this particular cell undergo cellular death by this apoptosis. So as we see, if this cell didn't rupture, so definitely it will not affect the neighboring cell, right? So that is it. So thank you very much.